Hi, it's Michael Kerr here, presenting Small Business Banter. A healthy micro and small business sector means a successful economy and a more vibrant society. Small Business Banter is about helping regional business owners better prepare for current challenges, but also for the next stage of business success. I'm Michael Kerr, founder of Kerr Capital, advisors to business owners. Each week, I interview a fellow small business owner or an expert, and they share their stories, their lived experiences, the wins and the losses, and their best advice to help you, the listener, get the most you can from your own business. Small Business Banter is brought to you from the studios of 104.7 Gippsland FM and is heard across Australia on the Community Radio Network. And thanks also to Kerr Capital, supporters of the show. Welcome into another edition of Small Business Banter Community Radio and Podcast. David Barnett from Canada joins me today. Welcome in, David. Dave, as I...
Well, thank you very much for having me, Michael. It's great to be here.
For listeners, David is an authority on small business sales, acquisitions. He trains, he mentors, he's been a broker. So he's all over small business. And what we wanted to do today was get some of Dave's wisdom and insights, talk specifically about a report that we've both just read on how some of the business sales have been going over the last quarter. It's a report from the International Business Brokers Association. So we'll get to that. Great to have you in. Can you give us a little bit of your current work activities and history?
As you said before, I was at one time a business broker. I owned my own business brokerage office for a little over 3 years. In that time, I sold about 35 companies for other people. And after leaving the world of business brokerage, I went into banking and eventually got drawn back into the world of buying and selling businesses, but this time with a different sort of business model. Today, I operate as a consultant and I work for buyers and sellers, but following the business model of lawyers and accountants, where I do work for people as they're progressing through a deal, and they pay me for the work that I do as I go along. So just as you'd hire a solicitor to make a contract for you, for example, and then they would bill you for that work, it's the same with me. So I'm no longer driven by contingency payments for the outcome of a deal. I just work with people for as much or as little as they want to use my services.
True advice. I'm unaffected by the eventual, or needing to have an eventual sale to earn something. So yeah, a long way away from that business broking model that we both know, which is everything about getting a result to get a commission. Yeah, you're prolific on social media particularly through YouTube, and we'll at the end I'll give you the opportunity just to shout out those various social media handles. Let's start with this International Business Broking Association report. The Australian business brokers are a party to that international body. They do a quarterly report based on actual sales of businesses inputted by brokers and others. There was a couple of really interesting findings for me, but do you want to give your kind of high-level take on key things in the report and the implications? And down here in Australia, there's some nuances and differences around a few things, but fundamentally, when we're talking about small business sales, Canada, America, England, different processes sometimes, but lots of similarities as well.
And the data that the IBBA collects, the membership in the IBBA is overwhelmingly American. And one of the things that kind of struck me when I was looking at it is that there are a lot of American states who did the whole lockdown thing in 2020 as the rest of the world did, but then quickly came out of it and got back to a business as usual sort of state before the end of 2020. And they never went back to lockdowns and other kind of mandates. Whereas, and I'm sure I know from the news that you in Australia, you guys had different public health mandates and regulations for quite some time.
Yeah, we sure did, particularly in Victoria where we are.
Well, and even in here in Canada, we were actually successful in 2020 in keeping the virus out of my region, and it meant shutting down provincial borders, and it meant restricting travel, and people had to isolate for 2 weeks if they did leave the province and come back. And it created a real burden in the economy as far as business operations. And even in January of 2022, some of the businesses that were considered non-essential were closed here where I live because we had another spike in the infection rates. And so when I was looking at the report that you mentioned, I was very interested to see how the data was looking, because in some places during that time period, people were acting and behaving as though it were 2019, while in other places that were also part of reporting jurisdictions, they were still operating under different facets of pandemic virus control. And some of the interesting things from that report were that the average transaction value in terms of dollars went up. And that one didn't really surprise me, because when the pandemic first hit, I had my business brokerage office during the recession, 08 to 2011. And so I know that if you're in a business that is going to be poorly performing, well, that probably means you're going to close the business, not try to sell it. Or if your business is poorly performing and you are not going to close, but you know that the price of the business is related to its financial performance and you can afford not to sell, you're probably going to withdraw from the market. You're going to say, well, you know what? I'm not going to sell under these conditions. I'm going to wait and let the business build itself back up, and then I'm going to sell in a few years. I saw many people do that in 08, 09, and early 2010. And so the average transaction dollar amount went up because it was the slightly larger businesses that were still transacting, that were able to be, resilient during the pandemic. In the pricing information, and I'm sure you probably talked on the show before about how businesses are priced as a factor of the cash flow. We talk about multiples all the time. The smallest businesses, what I would describe as the Main Street businesses, the multiples didn't really change at all through the entire time frame of the report, whereas the larger businesses did have a change in the multiples. You could see when the market cooled off and the market became hotter, and now it's starting to cool off again. But down on Main Street, they remained very consistent at just over 2 times seller's discretionary cash flow.
What's really interesting about that is, and let's just define those couple of things. By Main Street, in the report, it's less than $500,000 of business value. But that's not the end value of the business.
It's less than $500,000 in seller's discretionary earnings.
Yes, yeah. And then I think then you go to the next ranking is lower middle, which goes from $500,000 up to about I think $50 million of discretionary cash flow.
It's interesting because the terminology that we use to delineate these different categories in the business brokerage world is so very different from how, the people in the investment community would classify these different categories, right? For most of what I deal with, it's Main Street and lower middle market. And so I tend to ignore the data beyond that, because once you start to get into these, what these private wealth management firms are doing, I mean, they're not going to be buying the bowling alley at the end of the block. They're looking at much bigger concerns, and that's usually kind of outside of my area of work.
Largely in business broking in Australia, we're talking about Main Street. In terms of those multiples, that might parlay into a value of $1 million or $1.5 million, and that's we've got plenty of most of our businesses are kind of probably sub $1 million Australian. That are that you see advertised. So there's a couple of really interesting outtakes. The multiples stayed steady for the. I've got to keep getting his terminology right. Main Street. So less than $500,000 of discretionary cash flow. So in that market, people are largely buying jobs. Interestingly, one of the the takes from the report was that the buyers of those businesses, nearly 75% lived within I equated to about a half an hour drive.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes a whole lot of sense to me, that you're buying a job and you want to be relatively close to home. So if you're selling a business and, call it, in Australian terms, a small business, and call it a main street over there, your buyers, if you're looking around for where your buyers are going to come from, they're going to come locally. So I think that has a lot of implications for how you actually promote and sell the business.
And if you go online, you start, looking for information on selling your business, you find all of these articles about different topics, and there's a lot of stuff written out there about how, some investment banker or some big private equity firm is going to buy your business. But what you and I both know, we see it over and over again, is that the most common acquirer of a small business is an individual, often who wants to leave a job they don't enjoy. And they want to go and they want to take control of their time and and take responsibility for themselves and their life. And doing so through acquiring a business means getting into a business without the risks of a startup. And so it's really that individual person who is most likely going to be the buyer in most of these scenarios. And often there's, sort of a family package. I see a lot of buyers who have a high degree of involvement from their spouse in the decision making, and they have a plan for their spouse to come and work in the business as well, to be a part of the team.
True family businesses, control of your destiny. You buy a solid business, you go through all the stresses of owning a business, but it's yours, and you can make it what you want, which is what, I know we both champion that idea that it can, for the right people, beat a job in large corporate. So so we talk about, and just to clarify, we're talking multiples there of 2.2 to 2.8 of sellers' discretionary earnings, which the term is getting, I think it's getting picked up more and more here, but there's still this sort of desire to price businesses, after the salary of the owner has been taken out, calling it a true net profit. But you get caught up in what's a salary, and so I think what's a commercial salary. So I think that definition, of sellers' discretionary earnings, what the owners can take out and call it whatever they want, is a good place to kind of start to think about the value of a business to you. And then the next level up was, started to get priced and valued in terms of a more traditional multiple of EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization.
And so one of the things that I felt was being exposed in that report, because they showed that as in the main pandemic years, that the multiples for these larger businesses was increasing. And what I can tell you I was seeing through the different clients that I work with is I was seeing the effect of particularly the American government's efforts to help business through these different liquidity programs. So the big ones were the PPP program that they had there. And then the other one was the employment retention tax credit. I forget the exact terminology, but employers could apply and get credited for all the source deductions they removed from their employee's paycheck, given back to them as a credit, so a gift. And so I worked with some clients who would literally buy a business that had not exercised this employee tax credit redemption thing. They would buy the shares of the company, and then they would submit the paperwork for back collection of this benefit, and sometimes recover their entire down payment. And so
that's
the people who were tuned into these programs and understood the small print and how to do this stuff were suddenly put in positions where they were at the end of a fire hose of money. And this is, in my opinion, one of the reasons why we saw the multiples expand within a very short time frame. I heard, I was speaking with a business broker in Tennessee who was telling me that she had worked with a client that owned multiple businesses that all qualified for PPP loans, but didn't really need the money. and then they use that money to go and buy another business. And so when money starts to slosh around like that, I mean, we just have to remember back to that subprime mortgage crisis of 12, 14 years ago. When money is sloshing around and it doesn't take much to get your hands on it, what happens is prices get driven up. And I think that's exactly what we were seeing in that time frame. Those programs have now all come to an end, and things are now cooling off.
Yeah. And on today's edition of Small Business Banter Community Radio and Podcast, chatting with David Barnett from Canada, from a bunch of websites and social media channels that we'll talk about at the end. Dave, out of that report, look, I agree. We had those, those one-off subsidies and, that you see flowing through business financials, and it was a real challenge when you're preparing them for sale to say, is that it's a one-off. Possibly, we had different kinds of grants. It was a one-off, but normally you might say, well, that's not going to happen again. But then you'd argue, well, it inhibited that business from doing what it does, so it's kind of a replacement for revenue foregone. It was a real challenge. So I think in terms of multiples, we're seeing at the Main Street end, they're kind of staying the same. People want to buy a job, though, 2 to 2.8 times that seller's discretionary earnings. And then as you get bigger, the multiples start to get talked about in a normal way of multiples of EBITDA. A couple other things out of that report that I do want to touch on. Time to close. So I think I also read that more than half of, transactions that were, where brokers were engaged didn't close. That says there's a lot of, there could be a whole bunch of reasons why that happens, but less than half that went to a broker ended up closing. Mm-hmm. So that's, for an owner, you got it, and for a broker as well. You got to. That's got implications. It's not, things. It just reflects that things do change. Owners change their mind, businesses' performance gets affected. But the time to close was, up to about a year, 6 to 12 months, let's call it that. And in that, 2 to 4 months was the due diligence part, which might surprise a few selling owners.
Well, I think one of the reasons the time frame for closing got extended is so many deals were contingent upon performance in the latest quarter, whenever the deal was going to happen, matching perhaps 2019. Last year there were you talk about the one-off grants and subsidies that were coming from government. And yes, they did offset usually declines in revenue and declines in earnings in those businesses because of public health mandates. So the question then started to come about, how do I determine what the value of this business is if we have all these one-time events occurring? What I've seen consistently is that buyers will look at a business, and if they can see that the business has returned to its pre-pandemic performance, then what they're going to do is simply discount or not include the performance of 20 and 21 perhaps. And so I know that there were several deals that I worked on where buyers would extend the closing by an extra couple months and put a contingency in there that the business performance had to meet the 2019 performance or be quote unquote satisfactory to the buyer. They had to see that there was some sort of return to normal. And that sort of trend or expectation began in the states that went back to normal sooner. In other places, it's becoming more of a challenge, especially where consumer habits may have been potentially permanently changed. The people are not going back to the way
they've gone online. Yeah. That's true. It's something that it takes a lot of active management of an engagement, including managing the owner and the buyer to kind of manage them through that process of, saying, well, look, we acknowledge that the business had a big, dip in performance, but we can see that it might come back because, they look at other, pointers and other fundamentals. But it does highlight how important it, just generally in a selling process it is for an owner to keep their foot on the accelerator. Once you decide to sell, it's never over. And this highlights that perfectly. And so that, that next month's performance compared to, the same month last year and in the case of, COVID influenced business or impacted businesses maybe 2 years ago, how you're tracking. And it just, that spike in this month compared to same month last year can really kind of give the buyer a lot of confidence and the owner, the hope that they can actually get out, at somewhere more like historical, value. So, keeping the foot on the accelerator while you're selling is just so crucial. It's a lot. It's not the time to check out.
And the other point about that due diligence period that I think is important for every small business owner to understand is that, a lot of the presentation that a business owner makes to a buyer is their story. You tell the story of the business and what happened in the business, et cetera. For the buyer, though, they're going to be taking their savings. They're going to potentially be borrowing from family and friends. They're going to maybe borrow from the bank. They're going to potentially borrow from the seller in the form of a vendor note. And so they're going to be putting themselves fully invested in most cases into the acquisition of the business. And they can't do that entirely by simply relying on the story. They need to see the proof that everything you've told them is accurate. And one of the big ways I think that you can tell the difference between a really qualified business broker and one who's not so is that a really qualified business broker is going to pull all that stuff like, in the same way a dentist is going to pull on your teeth, a qualified business broker is going to pull that stuff out of you before you ever meet a buyer so that you can be more prepared, because the worst thing that can happen is for an excited buyer who wants to buy your business to be told to wait for 5 weeks while your accountant puts something together. You've got to be ready. It's got to all be prepared. And this is where a good broker is going to be able to help you by helping to get you prepared so that you're ready before that buyer comes on the scene.
Yeah, and then there's this, you have an information memorandum or a business summary prepared, and that's just not the end of the story or the preparation for selling. It's each month that ticks by after the end of that period when you've completed the information memorandum or business selling information is so crucial because we can see here from the numbers that it takes, can take a long time to actually close. Due diligence can be and is being extended. So in that time, the buyer's going to say, well, give me, I want to see what's happening, last week, or last month. And as you say, the broker's got to have that ready and be prepared to answer the questions.
Can I tell you a 40-second story about this?
Sure do.
One of the first businesses I listed for sale in 2008 was a fried chicken franchise. And the last business I sold before I left in 2011 was that fried chicken franchise. And I sold that over that 3-year period. I sold that business 3 times. And the first 2 times I sold it, it didn't complete because of problems that ended up arriving on the part of the buyer or the financing or something a lawyer said or something an accountant said, what have you. The 3rd time, it did complete. And so that just highlights the reality of these deals. And it can be very frustrating. Very frustrating, there's no question.
Yeah, no, look, this it just shows you just got to keep on it. Dave, look, we've already raced to near the end of this installment of our discussion. Look, what we'll do is we'll definitely come back and have another chat. There's a few points that I'd like to pick up on on that contained in that report, but I also want to give you just in this last little while an opportunity just to give us that list of places people can find you to hear about, the stuff you talk about, the work you do. There's a lot of courses, so fire away,
Oh, sure.
Dave.
The main place to find everything that I do online is at davidcbarnett.com. And if you are interested in learning more, you can sign up for my email list. And if you're a fan of YouTube, just look up David Barnett Small Business Deal Making, and you'll find me. I've got about 500 videos going back all the way to 2014, where I answer questions about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium-sized enterprises. And I've done a lot of interview programs there as well, where you'll see me discussing this with other experts in the field. And so if you want to learn about this stuff, there's tons of information there that I'm very happy to put out for you.
Yeah, look, the format's great. I've been tracking them for quite a few years. You answer real questions from brokers and owners, and it's that format really kind of resonates. You bring that mix of experience, and I endorse the work you're doing because there's a big gap there between expectations of owners just to list a business with a broker and sell. And getting a result. So you're educating and also holding hands and helping owners and buyers through that process. So, Dave, thanks so much for your time today. Really great to have that perspective, and we'll do it again soon. And continue to chat where I would like to have today.
Thanks, Michael, for having me.
So that is all for today's episode of Small Business Banter. I continue to be inspired bringing you small business experts and other small business owners and hearing their stories. If you want to listen to any past episode, jump onto your podcast platform of choice and search Small Business Banter. There you will find a diverse and fascinating collection of small business owners and experts openly discussing and sharing their experiences. For any of the links, resources, or information we've talked about on the show today, or to contact me, please head over to smallbusinessbanter.com, or you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And it would be great to have you tune in the same time next week for another episode of Small Business Banter.